The morning started just like any other at City General Hospital. The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the emergency room as nurses shuffled between patients, the gentle beeping of monitors creating a familiar backdrop to their routine. Nurse Joy, who had spent the last 15 years working in this very emergency room, was standing at her usual spot by the nurse's station. Her reading glasses sat perched on the edge of her nose as she flipped through patient charts, making notes about medication schedules. The clock had just struck 8:15 am when the automatic doors at the entrance made their usual whooshing sound. But what came through those doors was anything but usual. A large German Shepherd, soaking wet from the pouring rain outside, burst into the emergency room. His paws left muddy prints on the clean white floor, and his fur was dripping, creating small puddles wherever he stood. For a moment, everyone in the emergency room froze. A young man waiting with a sprained ankle stopped mid-sentence. The receptionist's fingers hovered over her keyboard. Even the security guard, who had been doing his morning rounds, stood still with his mouth slightly open. But the dog wasn't running wild or barking like you might expect. Instead, he moved with purpose, his intelligent eyes scanning the room as if he was looking for something or someone. His red collar, though wet and slightly muddy, caught the fluorescent light, showing that he wasn't a stray. This was someone's beloved pet, and something was clearly wrong. Nurse Joy felt a strange tug in her chest as she watched the dog. In all her years at the hospital, she'd seen plenty of unusual things, but this was different. The way the dog carried himself, the urgency in his movements, it reminded her of the service dogs that sometimes accompanied patients to the hospital. The security guard started moving toward the dog, probably thinking about hospital regulations and safety protocols. But before he could reach for the dog's collar, the German Shepherd locked eyes with Nurse Joy. There was something in those eyes that made her breath catch. A mix of intelligence and desperate pleading that seemed almost human. The dog took a few steps toward her, then looked back at the door, then back at her again. His whole body seemed to be saying, "Follow me, please. Someone needs help." His tail wasn't wagging playfully. Instead, it was held low and tense, like he was carrying the weight of his mission on his shoulders. As Nurse Joy looked more closely at the dog, recognition slowly dawned on her face. That red collar, she'd seen it before. Many times, actually, when a kind elderly patient would come in for his regular heart checkups. The dog would always wait patiently outside the hospital doors, sitting like a statue until his owner returned. The emergency room had returned to its usual buzz of activity, but Nurse Joy couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She noticed how the dog kept glancing between her and the door, how his paws shifted restlessly on the floor, how his ears remained alert and focused despite the chaos around him. Rain continued to pour outside, its patter against the windows growing louder. Thunder rumbled in the distance, but the dog didn't flinch. He remained focused, determined, as if he had practiced for this moment his entire life. When a crash of thunder made several people jump, the dog simply took another step toward Nurse Joy, his eyes never leaving her face. Other staff members had noticed the scene unfolding. A young intern was already reaching for her phone, probably to call animal control. But Nurse Joy knew this wasn't a case for animal control. This was something else entirely. A cry for help from a creature who couldn't speak, but was doing everything in his power to communicate. The dog's behavior struck a chord in her memory. She remembered conversations with his owner, who had proudly told her about his companion's background as a service dog before retirement. How the dog had been specially trained to alert others in emergencies. How he had saved lives before. As she stood there, time seemed to slow down. The usual emergency room chaos faded into the background as Nurse Joy faced a decision that could mean the difference between life and death. Hospital protocols were clear about animals in the building, but sometimes the right thing to do meant trusting your instincts over rules. The dog took another step toward her, leaving yet another muddy paw print on the floor. His eyes held a message that transcended the barrier between species, a silent but crystal clear plea for help. In that moment, Nurse Joy knew exactly what she needed to do, regardless of protocols or procedures. Sometimes, the most important signals for help come not through emergency phones or formal channels, but through the unwavering dedication of a four-legged friend who refuses to give up on their human. The moment Nurse Joy saw the red collar up close, her heart skipped a beat. The metal tag caught the light, and suddenly everything clicked into place. This wasn't just any German Shepherd. This was Max, belonging to Mr. Wilson, one of their most beloved elderly patients who lived in the small blue house just 3 blocks from the hospital. Her mind raced back to all the times Mr. Wilson had visited the hospital for his heart checkups. He'd always come alone, but would tell anyone who'd listen about his faithful companion waiting outside. "That dog," he'd say with pride in his voice, "he's smarter than most people I know." At first, the nurses had thought he was just another proud pet owner, but over time, they'd seen glimpses of Max's extraordinary intelligence. Mr. Wilson lived by himself, something his children weren't too happy about. "Dad," they'd plead during visits, "please consider moving to assisted living." But he'd always shake his head with a gentle smile. "I'm not alone," he'd insist. "I've got Max. He takes better care of me than any retirement home could." Now, standing in the emergency room with Max's intelligent eyes fixed on her, Nurse Joy understood just how right Mr. Wilson had been. The dog's fur was still dripping, creating puddles on the floor, but he showed no signs of the usual excitement or playfulness you'd expect from a dog. Instead, there was an almost human-like worry in his expression. She remembered Mr. Wilson telling them about Max's background one quiet afternoon during his checkup. "He used to be a proper service dog, you know," he'd explained, his eyes twinkling with pride. "Worked with the emergency services for years before retiring. That's when I got lucky enough to have him come live with me. Still hasn't forgotten his training, though. Watches me like a hawk, he does." The memory made Nurse Joy's stomach tighten with worry. If Max was here, something must be terribly wrong with Mr. Wilson. The old man had been dealing with heart problems for years, and despite his cheerful attitude during hospital visits, everyone knew his condition was serious. Just last month, Dr. Thompson had updated his chart with a note about increased risk of sudden cardiac events. Around her, the emergency room continued its usual morning bustle. A mother was trying to comfort her crying child, an elderly woman was filling out admission forms, and somewhere in the background, a phone kept ringing. But Max stayed focused entirely on Nurse Joy, as if he'd somehow known exactly who to seek out. She thought about the last time she'd seen Mr. Wilson, just a week ago during his regular checkup. He'd been his usual cheerful self, telling jokes and sharing stories about Max's latest clever acts. Yesterday, he'd said with a laugh, "I forgot to take my morning pills, and you know what this smart fellow did? Brought me the pill box in his mouth and wouldn't leave me alone until I took them." The memory sent a chill down her spine. Mr. Wilson had mentioned living alone was getting harder, but he'd been so determined to maintain his independence. "It's not just about me," he'd explained once. "Max needs our daily walks in the park, and you can't get that in a retirement home. Besides, he's not just a pet, he's my guardian angel." Looking at Max now, his fur matted from the rain, but his eyes clear and determined, Nurse Joy could see just how right those words had been. This wasn't a random visit or a dog that had simply wandered away from home. This was a guardian angel doing exactly what he'd been trained to do, seeking help when his human needed it most. Thunder rumbled outside again, and a few people in the waiting room jumped at the sound. But Max didn't even flinch. He took another step toward Nurse Joy, then looked back at the door, his whole body language screaming urgency. The tag on his collar jiggled slightly with the movement, a sound that seemed to echo Nurse Joy's racing heartbeat. The security guard was still hovering nearby, clearly unsure about how to handle this unusual situation. Hospital rules about animals were strict, and for good reason. But as Nurse Joy watched Max's unwavering focus and obvious distress, she knew this wasn't about rules anymore. This was about life and death, about the extraordinary bond between a man and his dog, and about the kind of intelligence and loyalty that transcended ordinary understanding. She could hear her colleague at the desk already reaching for the phone, probably to call animal control. But something in Max's eyes told her there wasn't time for that. Whatever was wrong with Mr. Wilson, it couldn't wait for bureaucracy and protocols. This faithful companion had run through the rain and broken every rule to get help, and now it was up to her to honor that desperate plea. What happened next in the emergency room was something that would stick in everyone's memory for years to come. Max, still dripping from the rain, didn't bark or make any noise at all. Instead, he displayed a kind of focus that made everyone watching hold their breath. His eyes never left Nurse Joy's face, and there was something almost human in the way he tried to communicate. The young intern who had been reaching for the phone slowly put it down, caught up in the extraordinary scene unfolding before her. Even the crying child in the waiting room had gone quiet, watching the big German shepherd with wide-eyed wonder. There was something special happening here, and everyone could feel it. Max took 3 careful steps toward the emergency room doors, then turned back to look at Nurse Joy. His movements were deliberate, like he was speaking in a language of his own. Step, turn, look. Step, turn, look. The pattern was unmistakable. He wanted her to follow him. His wet tail wasn't wagging like an excited pet's would. Instead, it was held low and steady, showing just how serious this silent message was. Nurse Joy remembered more details about Max's training now. Mr. Wilson had explained it during one of his longer visits, when they were waiting for test results. He's not just smart, the old man had said, his eyes shining with pride. He's been trained to recognize emergencies. Heart attacks, strokes, falls. He knows the signs better than some people do. And he knows exactly what to do if something goes wrong. The rain outside was getting heavier, drumming against the hospital windows like urgent fingers tapping on glass. A flash of lightning lit up the waiting room, followed by a rumble of thunder that made the windows rattle. But Max didn't flinch. His focus remained absolute, his eyes fixed on Nurse Joy with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. She noticed something else now. There was mud on Max's chest and legs, not just his paws. This wasn't just from running through puddles. It looked like he'd been lying down somewhere wet, probably staying close to his owner. The thought made her stomach twist with worry. How long had Mr. Wilson been in trouble before Max came for help? The security guard had moved closer now, his hand hovering near his radio. "Ma'am," he started to say, "hospital policy states." But his voice trailed off as Max did something remarkable. The dog slowly walked to the emergency kit hanging on the wall, rose up on his hind legs, and gently touched it with his nose. Then he looked back at Nurse Joy, his meaning crystal clear: bring medical help. A murmur went through the waiting room. An elderly woman whispered, "Would you look at that?" while her husband nodded silently, his eyes never leaving the dog. Even the receptionist had stopped typing, her hands frozen above her keyboard as she watched the scene unfold. Time seemed to slow down as Nurse Joy remembered more of Mr. Wilson's stories about Max's training. The dog had spent years working with emergency services before retirement. He'd been trained to guide paramedics to people in trouble, to recognize the signs of medical emergencies, and to seek help in exactly the right ways. This wasn't just random dog behavior, this was years of professional training kicking in when it mattered most. The young intern stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "I can cover your patients," she offered, understanding the weight of the moment. "This feels important." Around the room, other staff members nodded in agreement. They'd all heard Mr. Wilson's stories about his extraordinary companion, but seeing Max in action was something else entirely. Through the windows, they could see the rain coming down in sheets now. The weather was getting worse by the minute, but Max's determination never wavered. He made one more trip to the emergency kit, then back to Nurse Joy, his actions as clear as spoken words. "Someone needs help. Bring medical supplies. Follow me. Hurry." The whole emergency room seemed to be holding its breath, watching this silent conversation between nurse and dog. In her 15 years of nursing, Nurse Joy had learned to trust her instincts. Those instincts were now screaming that this was one of those moments where following the rules might cost someone their life. She could see Max's training in every movement he made. No panicked barking, no running in circles, no chaos. Just clear, purposeful actions designed to communicate one vital message. Someone needed urgent medical help, and there wasn't much time. This was exactly what he'd been trained for, and he was executing that training perfectly, even years after retirement. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the sudden quiet. Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, making Max's wet fur gleam under the fluorescent lights. His eyes never left Nurse Joy's face, and in them she could read both urgency and trust. Trust that she would understand, trust that she would help, trust that she would know what to do. Sometimes in life, you have to trust your gut and take a leap of faith. That's exactly what Nurse Joy did next. Without saying a word, she grabbed the emergency medical kit from the wall and nodded to the young intern. "I'll call if I need backup," she said quickly, already moving toward the door. The security guard opened his mouth to object, then closed it again, seeming to understand that some rules were meant to be broken. The moment Nurse Joy stepped outside, the rain hit her like a wall of water. Within seconds, her uniform was soaked through, her comfortable work shoes squelching with every step. But Max didn't hesitate for even a second. He moved with purpose, checking back every few steps to make sure she was following, leading her through the storm with unwavering determination. They turned down Oak Street, where the old maple trees offered little protection from the downpour. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the empty streets in brief, bright bursts. Most people were safely inside on a morning like this, but here was Nurse Joy, following a dog through the worst storm of the season. If anyone had told her this would be part of her job when she started nursing school, she would have thought they were crazy. Max moved quickly but carefully, making sure Nurse Joy could keep up. He didn't run ahead or get distracted by the neighborhood cats ducking under porches to escape the rain. His training was evident in every movement. This wasn't a panicked pet. This was a professional on a mission. When they reached intersections, he would wait for her, looking both ways before crossing, just as he'd been taught years ago. Water streamed down Nurse Joy's face as they turned onto Cedar Avenue. She knew Mr. Wilson's house was close now, the little blue one with white trim and a small garden out front. She'd seen it in photos he'd proudly shared during his hospital visits, showing off Max's favorite sunbathing spots and the flower beds they tended together. The rain made everything look different, though. The familiar streets had become small rivers, and the wind whipped fallen leaves into tiny tornadoes that danced across their path. Nurse Joy's legs were getting tired, her scrotes heavy with water, but Max's urgency kept her moving. The medical kit bumped against beside with every step, reminding her of what might be waiting at the end of this rain-soaked journey. As they rounded the final corner, Max's pace quickened slightly. Through the curtain of rain, Nurse Joy could make out Mr. Wilson's house. The morning paper was still on the front step, getting soaked, the first sign that something wasn't right. Mr. Wilson always grabbed his paper first thing in the morning, rain or shine. He liked to read it with his breakfast, he told her, while Max ate from his bowl in the kitchen. They reached the front door, and Max didn't waste any time. He led her around to the side of the house, where a small gate opened into the backyard. The gate was unlocked, another unusual sign. Mr. Wilson was always careful about security. The backyard was a mess of wet leaves and fallen branches from the storm, but Max navigated it with certainty, heading straight for the back door. The screen door was flapping in the wind, banging against the house frame with each gust. Through the kitchen window, Nurse Joy could see lights on inside. Her heart was pounding now, partly from the walk and partly from fear of what she might find. Max pressed his nose against the door, looking back at her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to say, "Hurry, please." The back door was unlocked, the third red flag that made Nurse Joy's nursing instincts scream with worry. Mr. Wilson was religious about locking his doors. "Can't be too careful these days," he always said. The fact that both gates and the door were unlocked meant something had interrupted his normal routine. As she pushed the door open, Max surged ahead, leading her through the warm kitchen. Everything looked normal at first glance. Dishes in the drying rack, a half-empty coffee cup on the counter, the morning's medication organizer open on the table. But then she heard it, a faint sound coming from the living room, barely audible over the storm outside. Max was already there, his wet paws leaving tracks on the hardwood floor as he moved with purpose toward the sound. Nurse Joy followed, her wet shoes squeaking against the floor, her heart in her throat. The medical kit felt heavy in her hands as she rounded the corner into the living room, not knowing what she would find but knowing that whatever it was, she was glad she'd trusted this extraordinary dog. The scene that greeted her made all the pieces fall into place. Why Max had come to the hospital, why he'd been so insistent, why there was mud on his chest and legs. But there was no time to dwell on that now. Her training kicked in as she quickly assessed the situation, already reaching for her phone with one hand while opening the medical kit with the other. In that moment, she knew without a doubt that she'd made the right choice in following Max through the storm. The living room felt eerily quiet compared to the storm raging outside. There, next to his favorite armchair, lay Mr. Wilson on the floor. He was conscious but barely moving, his face pale and drawn with pain. Max was already by his side, gently nuzzling his hand, his wet fur dripping onto the carpet. The dog's entire body seemed to relax slightly now that help had arrived, though his eyes remained alert and watchful. "Mr. Wilson," Nurse Joy called out softly as she knelt beside him, her wet uniform creating a small puddle on the carpet. "Can you hear me?" His eyes flickered open at the sound of her voice, and a look of relief washed over his face. He tried to speak but could only manage a weak whisper. "Chest hurts," he managed to say, his hand clutching at his shirt. Nurse Joy's trained eye quickly took in the signs, the shallow breathing, the gray tinge to his skin, the way his left arm lay limp at his side. This wasn't just any medical emergency. This was exactly what his doctors had warned about, a serious cardiac event. Max settled himself on Mr. Wilson's right side, providing warmth and comfort while staying out of Nurse Joy's way. It was clear from the mud on the dog's chest that he'd been lying like this earlier, keeping his owner warm and conscious until he could get help. Now he watched intently as Nurse Joy opened her medical kit, his ears perking up at the familiar sound of medical equipment being unpacked. "You've got a good friend here," Nurse Joy said as she worked, trying to keep Mr. Wilson calm while she checked his vital signs. "Max came straight to the hospital to get me. Smartest thing I've ever seen a dog do." A faint smile crossed Mr. Wilson's face at the mention of his faithful companion. Her phone was already connecting to emergency services, the speaker echoing in the quiet room. As she reported the situation, her hands moved automatically through the steps she'd practiced countless times, checking pulse, blood pressure, breathing rate. The numbers weren't good, but they could have been much worse if Max hadn't acted so quickly. Through the window, lightning flashed again, followed by a deep rumble of thunder. Mr. Wilson flinched slightly at the sound, but Max immediately pressed closer, offering silent comfort. The dog's presence seemed to have a calming effect. Mr. Wilson's breathing steadied slightly as he reached out to touch Max's wet fur. "How long have you been down here?" Nurse Joy asked gently, preparing an oxygen mask from her kit. Mr. Wilson's eyes flickered to the clock on the wall, then back to her. "Since early morning," he whispered, "was getting breakfast ready." That explained the half-emptied coffee cup in the kitchen, the open pill organizer. Max made a soft whining sound, and Nurse Joy noticed he was looking at something under the armchair. Reaching over, she found Mr. Wilson's phone. It had fallen just out of reach when he collapsed. The screen showed several missed calls from his children. The timestamps told the story. He'd been lying here for almost 2 hours before Max had run to the hospital. The sound of sirens in the distance brought a wave of relief. Help was coming. But as Nurse Joy continued monitoring Mr. Wilson's vital signs, she couldn't help but marvel at the series of events that had led to this moment. A dog, remembering his service training from years ago, had known exactly what to do in a crisis. He'd stayed with his owner long enough to make sure he was stable, then run through a storm to find the right person to help. Rain continued to pour outside, but the living room felt warmer now. Mr. Wilson's color was a little better, thanks to the oxygen and the emergency medication Nurse Joy had administered. Max hadn't moved from his spot, his body providing steady warmth and comfort. His eyes moved between his owner and Nurse Joy, as if he was monitoring both of them. The paramedics arrived with a rush of activity, their boots squeaking on the wet floor as they hurried in. They were some of the best in the city, and Nurse Joy knew Mr. Wilson would be in good hands. As they set up their equipment, one of them paused to pat Max on the head. "Good boy," he said quietly. "You did everything right." Max watched carefully as they transferred Mr. Wilson onto the stretcher, his eyes never leaving his owner's face. When they started to move toward the door, he stood up, shaking his wet fur, ready to follow. The lead paramedic looked at Nurse Joy, then at Max, understanding in his eyes. "The dog comes too," he said firmly. "He's earned it." As they moved carefully through the rain toward the ambulance, Nurse Joy couldn't help but think about the extraordinary chain of events she'd witnessed. A dog's intelligence and loyalty had quite possibly saved a life today. Max had not only remembered his training from years ago, but had also known exactly who to seek out for help. It was the kind of story that reminded her why she'd become a nurse in the first place, to be there when people needed help the most, even if that help came through the most unexpected channels. Word spread quickly through the hospital about what had happened that rainy morning. By the time Mr. Wilson was settled into the cardiac care unit, everyone from the cafeteria staff to the chief of medicine had heard about the extraordinary German Shepherd who had known exactly what to do in an emergency. The hospital had strict rules about animals in the building, rules that had been in place for good reasons. But sometimes extraordinary circumstances called for extraordinary exceptions. The chief of medicine herself came down to evaluate the situation, and after hearing the full story and seeing Max's impeccable behavior, she made an unprecedented decision. Max would be allowed short, supervised visits to see his owner. That first evening, as the storm finally began to clear, Max sat quietly beside Mr. Wilson's hospital bed. His fur had dried, and one of the kind-hearted nurses had cleaned the mud from his paws and coat. He hadn't eaten all day, refusing the food that staff members offered, until Mr. Wilson woke up briefly and told him it was okay. Only then did Max accept a bowl of water and some dog treats that a nurse had brought from home. The cardiac team was amazed by Max's continued behavior in the hospital. He never barked, never jumped, and seemed to understand instinctively which equipment he needed to stay away from. When nurses came to check on Mr. Wilson, Max would carefully move aside to give them room, then return to his watchful position as soon as they were done. The story of Max's heroic actions that morning spread from department to department. Hospital staff would find excuses to walk past Mr. Wilson's room, hoping to catch a glimpse of the remarkable dog who had saved his owner's life. Young doctors would stop by during their rounds, noting how Max's presence seemed to have a positive effect on Mr. Wilson's vital signs. The medical staff began referring to it as the Max effect, how their patient's blood pressure and heart rate would stabilize whenever his faithful companion was nearby. One of the senior cardiologists, who had been practicing medicine for over 30 years, stopped by specifically to observe Max. He watched as the dog adjusted his position every time Mr. Wilson shifted in his sleep, always maintaining gentle contact, always alert. "In all my years," the doctor said quietly, "I've never seen anything quite like this. This isn't just animal instinct, this is something more." The nurses in the cardiac unit started keeping a logbook of Max's visits. They noted how he would gently nose at Mr. Wilson's hand when his oxygen levels dipped slightly, often before the monitors even began to signal. How he would become restless just before his owner would wake up, as if he could sense the change coming. One nurse even caught him carefully tucking the blanket back up when it had slipped down during one of Mr. Wilson's naps. The physical therapy team was particularly impressed when Mr. Wilson began his recovery walks in the hallway. Max walked perfectly beside the wheelchair, then later beside the walker, matching his pace exactly to his owner's slower steps. He never pulled ahead or lagged behind, somehow understanding that these short walks were an important part of getting better. Children in the pediatric ward would press their faces against the windows of their rooms whenever Max passed by in the hallway. Their faces would light up at the sight of the big, gentle dog who had become something of a hospital celebrity. The child life specialists noticed how the story of Max's bravery seemed to help their young patients feel safer in the hospital environment. "If a dog can be that brave," one little boy said, "maybe I can be brave too." The hospital's volunteer coordinator started getting calls from other facilities asking about the possibility of incorporating more therapy dogs into their programs. Max had unknowingly sparked a conversation about the role animals could play in healthcare settings. The chief of medicine even arranged for a specialist to come and give a presentation about animal-assisted therapy, using Max's story as a prime example of the deep connection between humans and their animal companions. Mr. Wilson's children, who had been worried about their father living alone, saw their father and Max in a new light. They watched how Max anticipated their father's needs, how he provided both physical support and emotional comfort. The dog they had once seen as just a pet had proved himself to be an essential part of their father's healthcare team. The security guard who had initially been concerned about letting a dog into the emergency room became one of Max's biggest supporters. During his rounds, he would often stop by Mr. Wilson's room with a special treat hidden in his pocket. "You know," he told the nurse one evening, "sometimes the best security isn't about following rules, it's about knowing when to break them for the right reasons." As the days passed, the hospital staff began to realize that they were witnessing something special. This wasn't just a story about a dog saving his owner's life, though that alone would have been remarkable. This was a story about dedication, about the extraordinary bonds that can form between humans and animals, and about how sometimes the best medicine doesn't come in a pill bottle or an IV bag. Sometimes it comes with 4 paws, a wet nose, and an unwavering devotion that no medical textbook could ever fully explain. 3 weeks after that stormy morning, Mr. Wilson was ready to go home. The sun was shining brightly as Nurse Joy helped him gather his belongings, such a contrast to the day Max had burst through the hospital doors. The cardiac team had done amazing work, and Mr. Wilson's recovery had exceeded everyone's expectations. But they all knew that Max had played a huge part in that recovery. The morning of discharge was emotional for everyone involved. Hospital staff members kept finding reasons to stop by room 302 to say goodbye. The cleaning lady who had been sneaking Max extra treats wiped away tears as she gave him one final pat. The night shift nurses had left a handmade card, covered in paw prints they had made using ink pads, making Mr. Wilson laugh when he saw it. Even the usually serious chief of medicine came down to see them off. She had a special surprise, a formal certificate for Max, declaring him an honorary therapy dog of the hospital. The certificate might have seemed silly to some, but it represented something important. A recognition that sometimes the best medicine comes in unexpected forms. Mr. Wilson's children had spent the past few weeks making changes to their father's house. They'd installed some safety rails, rearranged the furniture to make walking easier, and set up a new system for his medications. But they hadn't pushed the idea of assisted living again. Watching Max over the past 3 weeks had convinced them that their father had the best possible caregiver already living with him. The physical therapy team had given Max a special vest with handles, properly fitted so he could help support Mr. Wilson while walking. The dog had taken to his new role immediately, as if he'd been waiting his whole life for this job. During the final therapy session, the lead therapist had tears in her eyes as she watched them practice together. "This," she said, "is better than any walker we could prescribe." As Nurse Joy helped Mr. Wilson with the discharge paperwork, she couldn't help but remember that rainy morning. She had taken a chance, broken some rules, followed a dog into a storm, and it had changed everything. Not just for Mr. Wilson and Max, but for the entire hospital. People walked a little slower in the halls now, smiled a little more, listened a little better to what their patients were trying to tell them. The pediatric ward had already started a new program, bringing in trained therapy dogs twice a week. The children would tell and retell Max's story, each version getting a little more elaborate, but the heart of it stayed the same. A dog's love and loyalty had saved someone's life. Parents reported that their kids were less anxious about hospital stays, often asking if they would get to meet a dog like Max. The security team had revised their protocols, creating special guidelines for service animals and therapy dogs. The guard who had almost stopped Max that morning had been a key part of writing these new rules. "Sometimes," he told the committee, "you have to trust that animals know things we don't." Mr. Wilson's story had even made its way to the local newspaper, though he hadn't wanted any fuss. The reporter had been most impressed by how the entire hospital staff talked about Max, not as a pet who had done something extraordinary, but as a colleague who had simply done his job perfectly when it mattered most. As they walked toward the hospital exit, staff members lined the hallway. It wasn't planned. People had just gradually gathered, wanting to be part of this moment. The same automatic doors that Max had burst through 3 weeks ago now opened smoothly before them. Mr. Wilson paused in the doorway, one hand on Max's special vest, the other wiping away tears. Nurse Joy stood watching as they made their way to the car waiting outside. Max matched his pace perfectly to Mr. Wilson's slower steps, just as he had done in the hospital halls. The sun caught his fur, making him look almost golden, so different from the rain-soaked hero who had appeared in the emergency room that morning. Before getting into the car, Mr. Wilson turned back to wave at the gathered staff. Max sat perfectly at his side, his tail wagging gently as he looked up at his owner. In that moment, Nurse Joy felt her own eyes filling with tears. In 15 years of nursing, she had seen countless patients leave the hospital, but this felt different. This wasn't just about medical recovery, it was about the extraordinary bonds that could form between humans and animals, about trust and loyalty and love. As the car pulled away, someone in the crowd started to clap. The applause spread quickly, a final salute to the remarkable pair. The sound followed them down the driveway, not just clapping for a patient going home, but celebrating a reminder that sometimes the most powerful healing comes from the simple, unwavering love of a faithful friend. The story of Max and Mr. Wilson became part of hospital legend, told to new staff members during orientation. But more than that, it became a reminder to everyone that medicine isn't just about procedures and protocols. Sometimes it's about having the wisdom to recognize help when it comes running through your door on 4 legs, soaking wet from the rain, carrying a message that only love could deliver.